Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This 30-minute podcast features a new author interviewed by me every single day, 365 days a year, for about 30 minutes. I am also the publisher for Zibby Books, which publishes 12 books a year in fiction and memoir. Our books are already out now. You can check it out on zibbybooks.com. And we have a magazine called Zibby Mag, where we have lots of wonderful essays and lifestyle features. That's at zibbymag.com. We have classes at zibbyclasses.com. And I recently opened a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop at 1113 Montana Avenue at 11th Street in Santa Monica. I hope that you are able to enjoy some of our other offerings. But this here podcast is the basis of all of it and started in 2018. And no matter what I do, this is basically my favorite thing. Enjoy. Brian Selznick is the author of Big Tree. He began his career as a bookseller at Eeyore's Books for Children in New York City. Oh my gosh, I totally remember that store. I loved it. Oh, I should have talked to him about this. And he has worked as a puppeteer and a set designer. His books have sold millions of copies, garnered countless awards worldwide, and have been translated into more than 35 languages. He broke open the novel form with his innovative and genre-defying thematic trilogy, beginning with the Caldecott Medal-winning #1 New York Times bestseller, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, adapted into Martin Scorsese's Academy Award-winning movie, Hugo. He followed that with the #1 New York Times bestseller, Wonderstruck, which was adapted into the eponymous movie by celebrated filmmaker Todd Haynes, with a screenplay by Selznick, and the New York Times bestseller, The Marvels. Selznick's two most recent books for young people, Baby Monkey, Private Eye, co-written with his husband, David Serlin. By the way, that is like one of my kids' favorite books ever, and Kaleidoscope, a New York Times notable children's book of 2021, were both New York Times bestsellers. He has also illustrated the 20th anniversary edition covers of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. And in praising his body of work, the Washington Post says, Brian Selznick proves to be that rare creator capable of following one masterpiece with another. Not surprisingly, when Big Tree came out, it also hit the bestseller list. Enjoy. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss your latest Big Tree. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much.
You are like such a genius. I don't even know what to say. This book is amazing. How you put yourself in the point of view of a seed and make us care and love. And I felt like crying and like how you have us see the whole world and like the system of communication and what it means and what monsters are. It's just amazing. And the illustration, I mean, it's so unique and so amazing, like all of your work, but still this is particularly powerful and awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. I that really means a lot. And it was very challenging figuring out how to tell a story about nature from nature's point of view, about two little seeds, and how to make us really be able to relate to it. But I think at a certain point, I realized that we all feel tiny and helpless and unable to do anything in a world that feels very much out of our control. And I write books about kids who have often been separated from their parents for various reasons and are themselves trying to find a safe place to grow up. And so I think I eventually realized that there actually isn't any difference between Merwin and Louise, who are seeds, with any of the other, human characters who I've written.
Oh my gosh. Why this theme? Where does that come from in you personally?
So, I mean, it's funny. I've always loved nature. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and there was a little area of like woods right behind our house that hadn't been turned into a development yet. And so I remember like crossing the threshold from my backyard, which is very manicured, into the wildness of the woods, and like how everything changed, the sound changed, the smell changed, the feeling in the air changed. It was very mysterious, a little dangerous. I didn't know if there were wild animals or jaguars around. And and eventually that got torn down and, built into other houses. But it wasn't this whole book started because I got a call from Steven Spielberg. And so it's like the most unexpected, weird journey for any book I've ever made in so many ways. Because usually like I have something on my mind that I very much want to figure out how to write a story about, whether it's French silent movies, which became Hugo, or deaf culture and the history of museums, which became Wonderstruck, London theater, which became the Marvels. But this time it was someone else literally planting a seed. And that someone else was Steven Spielberg. He called me like 6 or 7 years ago, and he had this idea. He wanted me to write a movie for him. And I flew to California. He turned out he was a huge fan of Hugo. And he asked me to write a movie for him about nature, from nature's point of view, because he realized that he had never seen a movie like that he had never seen a movie where the main characters were plants. And I thought to myself, well, there might be a reason, that we've never seen that. And I spent a couple of years working with him and the co-producer Chris Meledandri on a screenplay for what would have been a big animated movie. And I came up with these characters, this story, this time period. It's set sort of a little surprise at the beginning, because at first we think it's set today in a forest. And eventually, pretty quickly, we discovered that it's actually set at the end of the Cretaceous era, right before the asteroid hits the planet and destroys most life on Earth. So the planet's under an existential threat. And these two little seeds, I decided we're going to have to find a safe place to grow and try to figure out how they were going to save the world. And that felt like a good parallel for what was happening today without the existential threat towards, our planet, and how we feel, tiny and helpless. And sometimes we feel like we're wrapped in a blanket on a sick day at home, and we just we don't quite know where to be or what to do. We all feel like that sometimes. And so I worked on this with them until the pandemic hit. And in the pandemic, it became clear for various reasons that this movie was just never going to get made. And by that point, I had really fallen in love with the characters and the story. So I proposed to Mr. Spielberg that they give me the rights to the story and let me turn it into a book. And so this book that you have there, I have a copy here, is the outcome of that request. And in a funny way, even though it was actually meant to be a movie, and we never could have imagined the pandemic would happen, I feel now that the story actually was always meant to be a book. That because when it was a movie, I wasn't doing any art. Like, it was going to be professional animators. And we were like trying to figure out like where the faces were going to go on the seeds, because we all thought you needed to have faces on characters in a movie. But when I started doing the book, I realized the reason that the character designs never quite work with faces was because seeds don't have faces. Mm-hmm. And for the story, I had made a rule for myself that everything would have to be based in science. So plants actually can communicate with each other. So having the characters talk is fine, but trees can't like get up and walk around on their roots. So I wouldn't have that. That's why I needed like seeds to be the main characters, because they can actually move around and have some, volition. And then I just realized, the pictures need to have the same rule, and seeds don't have faces. So the seeds in the book don't have faces. I don't know. It's just like a very unexpected discovery that this story should be a book. And so I'm really glad I got the chance to do that.
Oh my gosh. Well, it doesn't matter that they don't have faces. Like, you still relate so much because of their thoughts and feelings and their journeys, and just, yeah. And even like seeing the dinosaur underneath and realizing, like you said, I was like, oh my gosh, like, oh, it's a dinosaur. It's amazing. And even the loss of the mom. I mean, I know this happens really early. I feel like I'm not giving much away, right?
Yeah.
I could take this out if you don't want me to say, but I don't know, like feelings of loss and like banding together. It's just it's so beautiful. It's amazing.
Thank you. A friend of mine who's a mom always said to me that what she thinks a good parent gives her children is roots and wings. And, roots to know that they have a family and a system where they're safe, yep. But wings to fly out into the world and discover who they are.
Yep.
And so when I started writing this book, I knew I wanted to use that because it would be literally the perfect thing for a tree to actually say. Ultimately, right, seeds have to leave their mama tree and head off into the world to grow.
Yep.
And, I don't have kids, but I understand that, one of the things you hope to do as a parent is to be able to raise someone who can go out into the world and have a good life. And that's challenging because you want to protect them and be able to, stop bad things from happening to them. But at a certain point, right, we all need to go out into the world and make our way. But we can do it, I think, perhaps more securely if we know that we come from a family that supports us and a good system of roots, and then we can really, use the wings we hopefully have been given.
And the sibling relationship too. I mean, I think a lot of parents, I don't know, do you have siblings yourself?
I do. I'm the oldest of 3.
Oh, okay. So you must feel like that protective instinct about your siblings. I'm the oldest too. And I don't know, I'm always I always feel that even though we're old now, I'm sure he doesn't want my protection, he's like a 40-something-year-old man, but inside I can't let that go no matter what. So
yeah, I think this is the first time I've ever actually written about siblings, because most of my kids are either only kids or orphans, and they make families around them like that. Like my books are very much about how we make our own family ultimately. And, we bring people to us who we love and who we want to be around, who we can support and who can support us. And, but this was really interesting to start to write about, or imagine writing about, a sibling relationship. And I think I also kind of ultimately discovered that they have very different personalities, as siblings often do. And Merwin, even though they're essentially the same age, Merwin kind of acts as the older brother.
Yep.
And he's very bossy and very secure in his knowledge that he's right, and very rigid. And his little sister Louise is very dreamy and poetic and kind of hears voices and talks to the stars in her dreams. And but she's the one who begins to understand that there might be a bigger purpose than just finding a safe place to grow, that maybe they have a larger thing that they need to do. And after I finished the book, someone asked me who these characters were based on, because people always want to know, who is this really? Who in your life inspired these characters? And for me, the answer keeps on being they're all me. It's all me. I can't say I'm conscious of that when I'm writing, but I'm one side of me is super rigid and wants to control everything around me. And that's the side that my husband gets mad at me about and causes me to have fights with people, but then the other side is that dreamy kind of, curious part that is creative and wants to connect to the bigger world and is very fluid and is much more able to listen. And, but those are two sides, and maybe there are two sides of all of us in different ways, but the balance shifts depending on who we are and how much therapy we've had, but that tension is very much, I think it's a very human tension. And as I've thought about it, I'm very aware that I am trying to allow Louise to outweigh Merwin, which is what ultimately, is a big part of the story of Big Tree.
I feel like this should be a New Yorker cartoon where you see the balance and then you see the little therapy sessions and then they walk out Oh my gosh, so funny. But you also in Big Tree, you still raise questions of, there are all these hardworking scientists, but if they don't have the right perspective, it doesn't matter how much they're aware and all the results. And what does it mean if you're so studying, but you don't even realize you're underwater? If you're so myopic, then you're not going to be able to take in everything and help anything, which is so interesting.
Yeah, there's these characters, the scientists in the book are little tiny creatures that Merwin and Louise meet when they get stuck underwater after various series of other adventures. And these little scientists are based on real creatures called foraminifera that are almost microscopic. The biggest ones are about the size of a grain of sand. And they're in all the water everywhere for all time. They've always been in the water. And when they die, their little tiny shells fossilize and capture the carbon from the atmosphere. And when scientists find these almost microscopic fossils from millions and billions of years ago, in the fossil of the foraminifera, they can see what the carbon level was at the time that they died. And that's actually how we know about climate change. So I turned these foraminifera into these characters, these funny little characters called scientists whose entire job underwater is recording data. And the foraminifera, the scientists that Merwin and Louise meet, are kind of working for this mad king. And he's a piece of seaweed who thinks he's, like in charge of everything and he knows everything. And everything he interprets is incorrect. He's never been out of the water, so he doesn't believe that land even exists. He's heard about it. It's like a fairy tale. And so therefore he thinks Merwin and Louise don't exist, even though they're standing in front of him. He decides they're imaginary and he always wanted imaginary friends. And so he captures them in this seashell. And so he's this kind of mad king of, Bavaria, like Ludwig, and he's just wrong about everything. And the scientists are saying that they're capturing all this information essentially for him. And Merwin at one point says, sort of what you were saying, which is, what's the point? If your data isn't being interpreted correctly, what's the point of collecting the data? And the point that they make is what's important is getting it right. And we can't control how other people interpret it. Yep. And our hope is that one day, because they, in my story, they purposefully inscribe the information on their bodies, all the information that they've gathered, but it's, sort of inspired by the idea of the carbon that's captured in their bodies. And they say, we trust that one day other scientists will come along who interpret our data correctly. And so for them in the future, we need to get everything right. And that's us. They don't know it, but they're talking about us. And because they did their jobs well, we are able to benefit from it. And that seemed like something that made sense for the world today and from various angles.
I mean, this whole thing, it gives me chills, just how it all links to today. And
good.
All the big meanings behind it. It's really amazing. So are you not upset at all that it's not a movie? Do you feel like this is way better because now you got to do the book? Are you a little bit sad?
No, it's so funny. What made me sad. I was about to say what made me sad was the pandemic, as if that was a shocking piece of news, right? We were all so devastated by the shutdown. And all of our lives changed in ways we never, ever imagined it could. The world changed in ways we never imagined it could. We're still obviously dealing with all of the ramifications of that. The world is still in great upheaval, which we feel every single day. And I often just look at ourselves and think, how does any of us get through a day? It is... luckily right now we are able to make pretend that some things are normal, which is great, but it's helpful to get through the day. But we all know nothing is normal. And also maybe it calls into question the idea that the fact that we thought things were normal earlier.
Right.
Is also a problem, right? A lot of things that we thought were normal, it's actually really good to recognize are in fact not normal. And so that sense of the upheaval and the devastation is what was so all of us is what I was dealing with. And so the fact that there's a book now, a physical object that we can all look at and open and read, we can listen to the audio version of it, the fact that this story has gotten out there because I wanted it to, right? I was told this movie isn't going to happen. Nothing was going to happen. And I got the idea to keep it alive, to make it a book. And I made it happen. Mr. Spielberg gave me the permission and encouraged me and loved the outcome. He asked to see the book when it was finished. He didn't ask for input as I was making the book, but when I finished, I sent it to him and the co-producer, Chris Meledandri, and they called me on the phone to tell me how much they loved it. And that's a really nice feeling. And so, no, the only thing I feel when I think about Big Tree is joy and gratitude that it exists.
Do you feel like it's more for kids, for grown-ups, or just for everybody? Because as a grown-up, I feel like this was still for me. I got so much out of it.
Good. Yeah. I'm very proud when I say that I write and illustrate books for children. Like, I love being a children's book writer and illustrator. I do a lot of things. I write screenplays and I'm working on shows and other things. I'm a puppeteer, but I always lead by saying I'm a writer and illustrator of children's books. So I'm very conscious of the fact that my audience is kids, and they're the best audience you could ask for. But I also really love when people who are not kids tell me that they've read my books and love them and relate to them and have shared them. And that makes me very happy, because ultimately, like, I'm not actually writing my books for kids. Like, I'm really just writing my books for myself. I mean, I'm aware that, like, I'm working in a job, and I hope that that job leads to a book that gets published and gets sent out into the world. I used to work at a children's bookstore before, I started, and I remember the thrill of reading all the books and getting the new books in, from all the authors who I loved, and dreaming of one day having one book on the shelf and how incredible that would be. And my first book was published while I was still working at the bookstore. So I got to, like, actually give that book to people, right? So the act of sharing is very much a part of the process, right? That's what I do. It's what you do. You're talking to people and sharing what you love about books, about reading, about what parents can gain, what kids can gain from the act of reading together, and talking about books together. So that act of sharing is very much part of why I do what I do. But, like, mostly I just, like, write because I write about things I want to write about that I find interesting, which usually are not actually things kids would normally find interesting. Like, The Invention of Hugo Cabret was about French silent movies, which is not a guaranteed bestseller in the children's book world. And so, but my editor early on said to me, because people would ask me what I was working on. I'd be like, I'm looking for children about French silent movies. And they'd be like, that is a terrible idea. And my editor said, if the main character cares about something, and then your readers care about your main character, they'll also care about what the main character cares about. And so that became very true for silent movies. Like, so many kids wrote me after Hugo to say, oh my God, we love watching silent movies now. And we made a silent movie festival for the, retirement community in our town. And so, Wonderstruck was about, like, the history of museums and deaf culture. The Marvels was about the history of British theater. Like these are things that people often don't learn about till, like, graduate school, if they learn about it at all. But I'm interested in it. So I find a way in for me. And because my main characters are usually 10 to 12 years old, that, is generally why I think my books are for kids. Like, I'm not specifically writing for kids, even though, as I said, I'm very proud of the fact that they're my main audience. It's just that the people who I think of to write stories about are 10 to 12 years old. So it makes sense that people who are that age mostly gravitate to that story, younger, older, but around that age. And so I'm writing about things that I love, but especially, I think, recognizing in Big Tree, like, I'm also writing about struggles that I need to figure out for myself, right? Like I was talking about, like, the fight between the Merwin side of me and the Louise side of me, right? So it's also a way to work through your own issues in a lot of ways. But again, in a way that hopefully is something that people can relate to, and that is universal, because generally we're dealing within themes that are often, bigger than just us. Whatever thing we're grieving, whatever thing we're struggling with, whatever thing we don't know how to do, like, generally we're not actually the only person dealing with those things. Maybe we have unique situations. We're all unique people. We all approach things uniquely. We all have unique families, but thematically, other people are dealing with similar things.
Very true. And there's no better way to connect than through the emotions and, the very core of all of that. But why have you picked this overlay? So obviously your topics are very interesting and they come from deep interests and academic and intellectual and everything. But to overlay the emotional sort of separation, like you were talking about earlier, with a child or from the parent, or even in Baby Monkey Private Eye, which I know I have to keep referencing because my son loves it so much. Like, this quest to like find the person you love and all of that, or what happens when you get separated. Like, where did that piece come from? Like, is there something with your, like, did you do therapy on that part of
it? I grew up in a very stable household. My parents were very supportive of me and my brother and my sister. They always said they would support whatever it is we want to do when we grew up. And when I was really little, like 5 or 6, I loved art. And somehow when my brother was like 6, he knew he wanted to be a brain surgeon. And my sister in kindergarten knew she wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. And that's what we all grew up to be. But I don't know, like we're talking very much about themes right now, but really when I'm writing, I'm not focused on themes. I'm focused on plot and character and like what happens next.
Right.
And when I finished Hugo, if you had asked me what that book was about, I would have said it's a book about a kid who lives in a train station who meets an old man who, help each other. But, a friend of mine is a theater director, and he says it's the artist's job to make the work and it's the audience's job to tell them what it's about.
Yep.
And very early on, when I was on tour for the book of Hugo, an adult reader came up to me and said, I love that Hugo is about how we make our own families. And I was like, it is? And I was like, oh my gosh. It is, right? Because that's what happens to Hugo. Like he, ends up finding this family. It's not his biological family because he's an orphan, but he gets a sister. He gets essentially parental figures in Georges and Jean Méliès, and he's safe in a home at the end of that book. And I think that idea of like going out into the world, like we were talking before with Roots and Wings, and making our own families, it is just really central to my experience. And I think growing up as a queer kid and like coming out very late, like I was in my like mid to late 20s before I even came out, it was like discovering that like, oh my God, there are other people out here who have been experiencing this thing that I've been keeping secret that I thought was just mine. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it's like, oh wow, like I'm actually part of a culture. I'm part of a history. And that's why these, sort of insane, horrific bans that are going on right now are so ultimately useless, except that they're going to hurt young people like that they're actively going to do. But what they're not going to do is make gay people not exist, right? Because we have existed through all of time. We have existed before there were names for us. And so you can't make us not exist. And the fantasy that like we only exist because we read about ourselves in a book is nuts. Because most of us, of a certain age grew up in a world where there was no positive role model. There were very few characters in books. There was no one saying it's okay, and so that sense of like needing to find a community and whatever community you're in, there are people who agree with you. Right? Like there are people on your side. I met a librarian recently at a librarian conference who's in a state that's facing a lot of difficulties in book banning. And I said, what can we do? And she said, just talk about us. Like just talk about libraries and the importance of libraries. And remember that even in a place where you feel like the entire community is ganging up against you, there are people in that community who support you. Sometimes they may not be as vocal because they might have to be at home taking care of their kids or whatever it is, but there is a community there. It's just sometimes it's a little harder to find them, and for young people, it is going to make things more difficult in a lot of ways. And so we just hope that we can keep getting the message out that there are people out there who love you and support you and want you to be okay.
Yes, I honestly can't even believe all this is happening in the world. It's like, it's anyway. Brian, this has been so interesting. I truly think you are such a genius in so many ways, and it's an honor to talk to you, and congratulations about Big Tree and everything that you're working on. And I'm just such a fan, and yeah, go forth and conquer.
Thank you. And thank you for the work you do, getting the word out into the world.
No problem.
It's really greatly appreciated. And it's so good to talk to you.
You too. All right.
All
Bye.
right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.